It was the summer of 1968. I was 8 years old and absolutely thrilled that school was out for the summer and freedom was at hand. I loved my summers off and was looking forward to all types of adventures with my cousin Jimmy. Jimmy was 6 months older than me and lived 4 houses down. Our families were very close and took vacations together and celebrated holidays with each other. So, Jimmy and I were tight. We were best friends. As great as I knew my upcoming summer was going to be, who could have thought it would get even better? Well, it could. And it did. It was a typical summer day off in June, and Jimmy and I had been out playing all day in the warm summer sun. It was dinner time, though, and time to come in. During dinner, Mom told us kids that she had something exciting to tell us. She explained that she and Dad had gone together with my Aunt Buela and Uncle George, Jimmy's parents, and had purchased 2 adjacent 1-acre lots out in the country, and we were going to build a cabin. My Uncle George had mad carpenter skills, and my dad knew plumbing and electrical. It was meant to be. I was so excited. We would be staying in camper RVs. My little 8-year-old brain started spinning. Summers were going to be one big camping trip with swimming, fishing, and forests to explore. I was bursting with joy. Lake Lorelei was the name of the gated community where we had purchased the lots. It had just opened, and very few lots had been sold at that time. Lake Lorelei is located in Brown County, Ohio. It now consists of a population of over 1,000 and is completely developed, but back then it was the middle of nowhere. The day came when we finally were able to see the property for the first time. Aunt Buela and Uncle George loaded up their camper, and my family did the same. Jimmy and I were more than excited, and the ride there was like waiting for Santa on Christmas Eve. Endless. At last we arrived. Jimmy and I jumped out of our respective cars to inspect the area. We were ecstatic. None of the lots around us were inhabited. All the lots to the left and right of ours were lush fields of wildflowers, tall grasses, and butterflies. Across the road from the property, the lots were empty as well and afforded a clear view of the pond across the street. About 5 lots down to the right was a small forest. My young brain did not question why those lots were not cleared to be sold. I was just excited that I had my own forest. Jimmy and I began exploring every nook and cranny immediately. We left after breakfast in the morning, came home for lunch, and was back out until dinner time. We loved it. One day we became curious as to the name Lake Lorelei. Our parents explained to us that Lorelei was a siren from Norse mythology who sat on the rocks along the Rhine River and sang so beautifully that sailors would be so enchanted that they would lose all their senses and crash their ships, only to die watery deaths. We, of course, found this perfectly, gruesomely awesome. As the summer passed, we eventually headed down to explore the small forest that was 5 lots down from ours. As we entered the forest, a creepy feeling descended upon us, but we continued on our way. In the middle of the forest, we found a dilapidated, decaying old house. It was very quiet all around us. No chirping of birds or any other insect sounds. The ancient house seemed to be beckoning for us to come inside. It was a bright sunny day, but the house sat in a dark, overgrown spot in the forest. We entered cautiously. The only audible sound was our footsteps as we stepped gingerly onto the creaky, rotting floorboards of the porch. The door was hanging off its hinges, and we just moved it aside and went into the house. The atmosphere changed immediately. It was even darker and felt cold, although it was 80 degrees outside. We stood still and just quietly looked around. Not much was left. Some broken pieces of wood furniture, bits of old paper, and cobwebs. Even though we were young, we were smart enough to know that the floor did not look safe, and we hoped there was no cellar. As my eyes scanned what once must have been the living room, I saw the corner of a black and white photo laying behind some cobwebs and old newspapers, beckoning me to come look at it. I made my way cautiously over to the picture, making sure with each step that the old boards would hold my childish weight. As I looked down at the picture, there was something compelling about it, and I reached down and snapped it up. It felt cold in my hands. The edges were tattered, but other than that, the picture had seemed to withstand the ravages of time. It was a photo of a beautiful woman sitting on a rock on the shore of what appeared to be a lake. Though the photo was in black and white, I could tell her hair was a very pale blonde. It was piled high on her head with bewitching tendrils escaping and hanging down to frame her face. I could also tell that her eyes were a light, icy blue. She had a slight smile on her face and was dressed elegantly in a long dress from an age long ago. As I continued to inspect the picture, Jimmy noticed and slowly headed over to see what I was looking at. Something about her was mesmerizing, but at the same I felt icy shivers up and down my spine, and I rapidly dropped the photo. Jimmy reached down and picked it up, but I could tell he felt uncomfortable holding it as well. As he looked at the image in the picture, we began to hear light laughter. It was a woman's laugh. It was melodic, and just hearing it made you want to know the joke so you could join in. But suddenly the laughter began to change. It went from a beautiful musical sound to a wicked cackling noise. Jimmy and I were frozen in the spot, staring at each other with eyes as wide as saucers. Then the evil laughter turned into a high-pitched scream. We needed to hear no more. Jimmy quickly dropped the picture onto the floor and we bolted to the crooked door, no longer concerned about the rotting floorboards. We slid the door to the side and began to run through the forest as only 8-year-olds in great shape can run. We leapt over fallen logs, dashed through heavy overgrowth, and dodged branches until we could no longer hear the horrific screaming. Once we reached the tree line, it was like we crossed into a whole other world. Birds were chirping, butterflies were floating lazily on the gentle breeze, and the sun felt warm on our chilled skin. We slowed down to a walk, both of us quiet. Our uneasiness began to abate as we walked across the meadow, and we began talking about the whole experience. In our minds, the woman in the picture could only be Lorelei, the beautiful siren who lured sailors to their watery deaths. And as for the laughter and the scream, we both decided it would be best not to tell anyone, lest we be forbidden to explore and lose our freedom. But we never went back to those woods for the rest of the summer. Summer turned to fall and fall to winter, and we didn't visit Lake Lorelei near as often. As the school year passed slowly by, with each passing month, I got more excited for summer and the cabin. Finally, summer arrived. A lot of progress had been made on the cabin, and I use that term loosely. As the foundation was down and the frame up, it was obvious it was going to be a big house. It consisted of 5 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a great room with a huge stone fireplace, and there was a porch that wrapped around 3/4 of the house. But it was not even close to being done. The shed was finished, though, and Jimmy and his parents slept in there, while my family still slept in the camper. Another great summer began at Lake Lorelei, and Jimmy and I were looking forward to the upcoming weekend. There was a carnival visiting the small town near us, and our cousin Cheryl was coming to spend the weekend. Although Cheryl was a mere 6 years old to our advanced 8 years, Jimmy and I enjoyed her company immensely and were looking forward to showing her the property, and had many adventures planned. Cheryl was dropped off by her parents on Friday night, and we were up bright and early on Saturday morning. Jimmy and I had so much to show her. We took her to the small pond, the cool dam where the water trickled down to the big lake, Lake Lorelei, and everywhere else. Everywhere but one place. Later on that day, Cheryl looked curiously down at the wooded forest area and asked if we ever explored there. Jimmy and I both felt strange and just said we don't go there often and gave no reason. Before she could ask more, we changed the subject to the carnival that evening and all the junk food we would eat and games we would play. The carnival was a blast, and it was dark when we arrived back to the property. Jimmy and his parents went to the shed, and Cheryl was sharing a bed with me in the camper. I was awakened in the middle of the night by Cheryl shaking me. From the look of her green face in the little light we had, it was obvious that Cheryl had overindulged in junk food. I woke my parents up and let them know that Cheryl was feeling very nauseous. Mom and Dad took her outside and I followed. They took her around to the other side of the camper and I took a seat at the picnic table in the front. There was a crescent moon that night, but the stars were very bright back then, and I could somewhat see in the darkness once my eyes became accustomed. I was sitting at the table with my back to the camper and facing the forest 5 lots down. I wasn't really paying too much attention when a figure walked towards the picnic table. I immediately assumed it was my Aunt Buela, as she would come out at night for smoke breaks. As the figure walked closer to me, I realized it was not my Aunt Buela, who had raven black hair and was short. This figure had pale blonde hair piled on top of her head and was very tall and slim. I stared at her aghast. It was the lady from the picture who Jimmy and I called Lorelei. She was very pale in the dim light, almost a bluish white. She sat down across from me at the picnic table and I just stared at her, unable to form words. As she sat there eerily in the still night, suddenly she began to laugh. The same melodious laughter that I had heard in the old, dilapidated house the summer before. And just as before, the laugh started to change. It became a shrill cackling, and as I looked at Lorelei, she also changed. It was not a gradual metamorphosis. It was an instant change. The beautiful blonde hair was gone. Her hair was now gray and hung in matted clumps down the back of her black hooded cloak. Her face was a greenish pale color, and it appeared that worms were moving around under her skin as the flesh undulated. Her teeth were brown and very sharp and pointed like the teeth of a shark rather than a person. I was frozen in place, unable to move or scream. The laugh turned to a screech, and the horrific figure across the table began reaching for me. Her fingers were very long and skinny, and she had sharp, pointy fingernails that started to scrape across my face. I suddenly was able to move but still hadn't found my voice. I jumped up from the picnic table and began to run, unable to scream for help. I do not know why, but I found myself running barefoot across the road as fast as I could in the dark. As I kept running, not daring to look behind me, I heard her coming after me and gaining. As I looked in front of me, I realized that I was running foolishly straight to the pond. There was no way to verge off that course, and I began to panic. Lorelei was right behind me. I could smell her fetid breath. Once I reached the pond, there was nowhere to go. I turned to face her. Her eyes were glowing a fiery red in the dark, her hands raised, reaching and grasping for me. Suddenly, I found my voice. I closed my eyes and began screaming over and over, waiting for my fate. As I continued to scream, I felt someone's hand on my shoulder shaking me. It was my mom, and I was sitting at the picnic table, no longer by the pond. I was so confused. Mom asked me what was wrong with a look of extreme concern on her face. I was crying and trying to get it out. Lorelei, the horrible scream, the witchy appearance. Mom began hugging me and told me Lorelei was not real and that I must have fallen asleep at the picnic table and had a nightmare. I knew that was not the case. It was real, and my feet still hurt from running across the sharp rocks barefoot. I knew Lorelei had been there that night and that she was pure evil. We went back to bed, and it took me a long time to fall asleep. The next morning dawned as ever, and Sherry's parents came to take her back home. After she left, I grabbed Jimmy and told him I needed to speak with him, as I knew he would believe me and that it was no nightmare. I told him everything that had happened the night before. We decided to walk over to the pond and investigate. As we got close to the pond, to the spot where Lorelei had confronted me, I looked down at the mud beside the water's edge, and there was one lone footprint, a bare footprint about the size of mine. I looked at Jimmy and he looked at me. I slowly reached down and took my shoe off and placed it gingerly into the footprint. It was a perfect fit. I put my shoe on quickly, and Jimmy and I ran back to the camper. We both knew that Lorelei was real no matter what the adults said, and we both vowed to never go out by ourselves after dark. The rest of the summer passed by quickly, and we never went to the forest or out alone past nightfall. Our parents never seemed to notice, and we just kept it as our secret. The summer ended, and it was back to school. Tragically, in the fall, Aunt Buela died of a sudden heart attack. Everyone was grief-stricken and no longer wanted to go out to Lake Lorelei, as it wasn't the same without her. The property was sold, and I never returned to Lake Lorelei ever again. I still don't know exactly what went on that night long ago. As an adult, I'm sure now that the entity was not Lorelei, the siren from Norse mythology. But I'm just as sure to this day that she was real. I still can't explain how I ended up back at the picnic table. But I know what really happened that night, and often wonder if the dilapidated house is still there all alone in the middle of the forest, and if Lorelei still haunts that land. Jimmy sadly passed away 2 years ago, and I no longer have anyone to discuss this frightening encounter with. At least no one that would believe me. Rest in peace, Jimmy. I dedicate this to you.
To preface this story, I'd like to share that this happened at Fish Lake National Forest in Utah. There are 3 Kent's Lakes: Upper Kent's Lake, and Lower Kent's Lake. This happened in the middle one. I am no stranger to the paranormal and unknown. I've seen many unexplained occurrences, and I'm pretty sure my house is haunted, but that is a story for another time. I was camping at the lake with my father and younger sister. We often go camping, but usually we camp closer to home in Southern California. This campsite was a bit more secluded than we were used to. We often camped with our neighbors as well, whom I get along with well. They were not with us on this trip, and after an 8-hour drive to get to the campsite, me and my sister were starting to argue a lot. The lake was beautiful. We saw lots of chipmunks, squirrels, and fish, as well as some elk and deer and cows. We even saw 2 golden eagles. The beauty of the nature that surrounded us lulled me into a false sense of security. After a particularly nasty fight with my sister, I went off exploring in an attempt to calm myself down. I've struggled with anger issues in the past, something I'm working with my therapist to get better at. I crossed the lake angrily, unaware of my surroundings. I got to the floodgate on the other side of the lake and was about to head into the forest when suddenly everything felt wrong. I felt as if someone were there and they didn't want me around. There were no animals or bugs in sight, which was very strange. I contemplated turning back, or at least going back to camp to get a radio so I could call for help if I needed to. But then I remembered how mad I was at my sister, and as the fury grew again in my mind, the doubt practically disappeared. My anger blinded me from any sense of dread or self-preservation. Still, as I trudged into the thickly wooded forest, I felt myself constantly checking for my throwing knives on my belt as if somehow they'd disappear. Eventually, as I kept walking and the feeling got worse, I pulled out one of the knives from its place on my hip. As I gripped the hilt, I really wondered how much damage such a small knife could do. I continued going, though, not letting my fear stop me. As I walked through the forest, it was dead silent, not in the way that a silence fell over the forest, but that I was the only thing making a sound since I left the shore of the lake. This too was concerning, but I brushed it off, saying my loud footsteps probably scared all the animals away. I came across a gross smell, stopping in my tracks. As I looked around, I could see nothing until I glanced down. Mere inches away from my left foot was a dead squirrel. Gross, but still, not out of the ordinary. I had to wonder, though, why were there no flies swarming around the dead body? I carefully stepped around the body, feeling kind of sad but continuing on. About 10 minutes later, I decided to take a break. I had asthma, and it was getting hard for me to breathe. As I sat still, now completely silent, the woods were too. It was as if someone had just stopped time. I began to feel nauseous, and I thought heading back might be a good idea. I looked over at the seemingly empty forest ahead of me, and I noticed a hawk feather. I thought this was really interesting, so I walked over to pick it up when I noticed another. Then I realized there were a lot of feathers, and the corpse of a hawk. I was starting to really get freaked out, so I grabbed my knife and booked it out of there. I was almost running, but not quite because I was in a thickly forested hill. I was almost to the shoreline. I could see it. Then I heard something. The snapping of a branch. I heard something for the first time since I had entered those trees. I froze, turning around slowly in case it was a deer or elk. There, sitting on the forest floor, was this thing. I have no idea what it was, but it was dark, like a shadow. Its limbs were almost undefined, and they were long and thin. It crawled on 4 legs, almost like a giant bug, but it was quadrupedal. It had white, almost glowing eyes. Those eyes were full of hatred. This being was bigger than almost anything I'd ever seen. Its arms almost as long as my entire body. It seemed to have no facial features besides eyes. No nose, no mouth, but it had hands. Hands with 5 fingers and filthy blood-stained claws. I ran as fast as I could. I ran out to the shore, too terrified to look back. My lungs were burning, but I didn't stop running until I got back to the campsite. It followed me to the edge of the tree line, but I don't think any further. I know it followed me because as I ran out onto the shore, I felt something grab my ankle, and as I yanked my foot back, my boots were splashed with blood, and I got a nasty scratch on my ankle to prove it. When I got back, I didn't tell my dad or my sister, in fear they wouldn't believe me. Instead, I told them I had fallen. That's how I had gotten scratched. I don't know what I saw, but I know it wanted me dead, just like that squirrel and that hawk. I've tried to do research, but I really don't know what it was I saw out there. All I know is that I'm never going back to Fish Lake National Forest ever again.